Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Robert Farley. I am a assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Matt Yglesias, who is the business and economics correspondent for Slate. He has worn many hats in the past, but that's currently the hat that he wears. How are you doing today, Matt?
I'm doing well. Doing well. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It's actually it's been a very pleasantly cool week in Kentucky after some very threatening weather last week when it really seemed like summer was going to come on with a vengeance. But it's been almost manageable the last few days.
That sounds good.
So, what's that?
That sounds good.
Yeah. No, it's been quite solid. What we're going to talk about today is what sort of has become your major interest, or at least your major international interest. But I think it's sort of broadly becoming everybody's interest, and to the extent that we're even sort of talking about it in the context of the U.S. election. The broad thing here is the future of the euro and the future of the Eurozone economy, and the narrow here is the elections that happened last week in France and in Greece that may have essentially rewritten the possibilities for what's going to happen over the course of the next months and years with the euro and with the European economy more generally. So I guess to start off with, what were your first thoughts when when it became clear that France was going to get a new president?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about this election is that it wasn't much of a surprise. We saw in the polling that this is what was going to happen, but for various reasons of propriety and so forth, no one in the American government or the German government could at least officially start laying any groundwork for the change here. So we had Hollande win the victory, and then, which was completely expected, but then have very suddenly had to shift into this mode where, he has to hold meetings with people. We need to find out what's actually sort of going to happen. And because he held such a large lead throughout the campaign, wasn't actually forced to speak in a great deal of detail about what his plans are or what his agenda is. So I know there's a great deal of uncertainty in the Treasury Department, for example, as to what is the actual agenda here.
No, I mean, this is actually kind of interesting because, I think you have blogged before, and I know some other people have blogged about this, about how it would make so much more sense in the U.S. context if we had something like a shadow minister situation, like right. Of course they have in the United Kingdom. But this seems to be one case in which even having a shadow minister doesn't really help. Were there talks, do you think, behind the scenes between Cameron and Hollande, between Merkel and Hollande, and so forth, between their people? I mean, it would seem that, especially in the context of what is a deeply integrated economy, you would almost need to have those kinds of contacts going on, regardless of sort of the impropriety of speaking with the opposition in a neighboring country.
Yeah, I mean, you can only assume that some kind of messages were passed. At the same time, it's literally the case that Hollande had never been in a room with Angela Merkel or with David Cameron, which is a little bit unusual. I mean, it's not that big a continent, and it seems like it should be standard practice for European officials to try to keep in touch with the major party leaders, even when they're out of office. But they don't seem to have done that in practice. France also has this slightly strange hybrid system where we know that Hollande will be president now, but the parliamentary elections happen separately about a month from now. People assume that if the Socialist Party wins the presidency, they'll also control the parliament, and Hollande will be forming a government. But there's at least some chance that won't happen, or that the National Front will somehow surge. So there continues to be some uncertainty as to what the actual outcome is here.
Right. In some ways, yeah, but. I guess the socialists are favored, though, right, in these elections. It's not just an assumption, right?
Right.
There's good reasons to think that the socialists...
No. I mean, the polling is all behind them, and they changed the calendar, to try to make this happen. The system is designed to produce a strong presidential majority, and, everybody sort of assumes that it will. but it at least on paper seems like it really transforms the situation in Europe, where we had, in theory, European Union decision-making mechanism is extremely complicated, 27 countries operating by consensus. But in practice, most of the countries in Northern Europe had sort of delegated their negotiating authority to Merkel and to Germany, which was facilitated by the fact that Germany is by far the biggest of those countries, but also by the fact that conservative political parties were running all of those countries. So there was some, sense of common purpose, which it seems like Hollande is going to undermine, and he is, claiming they're going to renegotiate this treaty. He can't actually force the treaty to be renegotiated, but you could bring everything to a standstill, essentially.
Right. I mean, you have a situation here which, and sort of people who, don't know a ton about the EU, maybe they know well, frankly, in the United States, nobody knows even what qualified majority voting means. But anyway, when you don't know a ton about the EU and you don't know a ton about the mechanisms, or even when you do know quite a bit about the official mechanisms of voting and decision-making, the notion of 27 states really does seem alarming. But in practice, as you suggest, on big questions and often on small questions as well, when France and Germany are united on an issue, they are able to make side payments, they are able to make side threats and so forth, which can essentially, quasi-coerce, quasi-convince the rest of the states to go around. So occasionally you have these issues where Slovenia or Slovakia has, appears briefly to be sort of a major problem in some sort of formal sense, and it turns out that they're really just sort of holding out for a side payment or something along those lines from the. So anyway, as I was saying, the requirement for unanimity, even outside of qualified majority voting, is often much easier to get than it sort of would appear to be, and the big countries can get what they want. But what Hollande brings up is sort of, as you suggested, that we have a situation here where the big countries may disagree on an issue which is pretty profound to the future of the European Union.
Right. And you also had here, there was a very unusual sort of break in the informal norms where early in the French campaign, Merkel, was openly campaigning for Sarkozy, which she abandoned because it turned out to be a bad tactic just in the domestic politics of France. But that was a kind of, new evolution in the sort of the informal norms governing things. But, it backfired. The French population didn't react well to that. And then her preferred candidate lost. But so now it's it's not even an open secret. It's just out in the open that, she preferred the other guy. And it seems like they're going to launch up sort of at loggerheads. And Germany, by conventional standard, is still by far the more influential actor than France in these terms, except that the French position is likely to be more favorable to the interests of Spain and Italy and some of the other countries. So one of the statements we've heard from Hollande is that he said that they should move beyond the France-Germany duopoly and have many countries in the decision-making process, which seems like an effort to sort of, to recognize the fact that since German unification, a system where France and Germany co-decide is really sort of just a system where Germany decides.
Right.
So, it's sort of untested. Can France and Germany and Italy and Spain really all collectively, in an effective way, collaborate on economic decisions? It just seems logistically hard to do it that way. There's a reason the norms had kind of evolved the way that they had. But, if France and Germany don't agree, then you can't make decisions through informal agreements between France and Germany.
Right, exactly. And so we we've had these kinds of situations in the past in the European Union. This is not the first time that there has been this extent of disagreement. But the problem in this case is that whereas, the history of the European economic community to the European community to the European Union is one of, we political scientists refer to it as punctuated equilibrium,
right.
where you'll have some period of equilibrium for a time, where all the actors, where nothing moves forward because the actors disagree over some profound thing, and then the environment changes, and so those disagreements either are resolved or they become irrelevant, and then you move on to a new stage of the European Union. The problem here is that we're not at an equilibrium point, right? I mean, right now we are not on stable ground, and so the European Union can't just sort of sit back and say, okay, we'll just freeze right here, and we'll wait until this crisis passes and until a more stable consensus around some policy develops, right? Rather, you have a situation where the EU is faced with the potential for serious collapse. Right now, probably not of all the EU institutions, but at least of a major, extremely major EU institution. Now, we shouldn't let this go by without saying that. I think you would argue, and I think I would also agree that the French essentially have it right here. That the what is broadly perceived to be German-driven austerity policies, which are based sort of on German national interests, which you can then argue are based on the interests of the German investor class, are broadly speaking bad for Europe in the sense of being bad for the EU and bad for Europeans, right? Would that be a fair characterization?
If you think about the European Union as a unitary entity, which in economic terms it to an extent is, it has one currency, it has one monetary authority, and it has overall actually a very modest debt burden, much lower than the debt burden of the United States or Japan. So there's a clear capacity.
Do you know what that is? Just off the top of your head, do you know what the overall European debt is?
I think if you average it out, it's in the 40s.
Oh, really? That's very good.
So quite low, because the more indebted economies are small. Portugal it's like a drop in the bucket. So Europe as a whole has a great deal of capacity to engage in more expansionary fiscal policy. But in practice, that would involve German transfers to lower income, more hard hit parts of the continent. So it's understandable that this is not a solution that the German political system wants to arrive at. But it is true that if you were to sort of pretend that this was the United States of Europe, that Hollande's position is the correct one economically, that the median European would be better off if Merkel would soften her position on this and in fact become sort of much more generous. So you have to an extent, you have a dispute between the interests of Germany and of countries like Italy and Spain, happening. And to an extent, you have what's more like a pan-European, ideological difference of opinion about what's the correct way forward. We're of course aware in the United States, it's possible for people who fully identify themselves with the interests of the United States of America to simply disagree about how do you want to do economic management. So you have some of that in Germany. Although this is also putting the German Social Democrats in a bit of an awkward position, because I think that their analysis sort of suggests that Merkel is wrong, but their political interests are very, very much against saying, the right thing for Germany to do is to just sort of give up on the concrete economic interests of German people.
Right.
Right. That's not like a winning platform.
No.
So what they've been doing in Parliament is just backing. They've been backing Merkel's bills and giving her cover for some moderately unpopular sort of policies toward Greece, while sort of sometimes trying to opportunistically snipe at her, but not really challenging her leadership, because the only, they could take a more popular position than hers, but they think that that position would be irresponsible. Or they could take the position that they think would be more responsible, but would be even less popular.
So, I mean, and I think we'll get to Greece in a bit, but a lot of the talk, and you blogged about this, and again, and a ton of other people, lots of people blog about this. Talking about countries like Spain or Greece in terms of how much pain they should endure right now to remain within the euro, to remain within the EU. What they get out of there being a powerful sort of continent-wide integrated connection with the strong economies of Northern Europe. And I know this conversation goes on all the time. I mean, it's a very important conversation in Greece, right? It's the central conversation, right? I mean, why are we enduring this pain? So before we get to that, though, Germany's case really is different, right? Because, I mean, one of the reasons the Germans give a go-ahead for losing the Deutschmark and all of this other stuff is because, I mean, Helmut Kohl understood, but also Mitterrand and the others, we're still acting in 91 and 92 under a certain shadow of World War II, right? And German policymakers in particular were still, and Kohl in particular, was still in some sense trying to reassure the rest of Europe about Germany's intentions. And that seems to me almost, that's played out, and perhaps it's even good that it's played out, right? That Germany just no longer feels it has to apologize for World War II. But going forward, how would a party like the Social Democrats make a coherent argument for a responsible policy that would keep the EU together as as part of Germany's long-term interests, even if Germany had to accept sort of short-run losses? How do you go and make that argument if you're the Social Democrats?
Well, I mean, I think to some extent it's difficult simply because moving to the single currency just wasn't a great idea, on the merits. But I think it's very clear that the rest of it, that the integration of a common regulatory framework for product markets, that the opening of free travel between borders, that the trade of goods and services, has been extremely beneficial, and not just for narrow reasons of German war guilt. We had 20 years ago, right, very reputable people were saying, well, with the Cold War over, Europe is going to go back to some dynamic of possibly violent international conflict in Western Europe. That would be a disaster. And the existence of intergovernmental framework and institutionalized cooperation on little practical things, starting with coal and steel and, moving forward to common passport controls and so on and so forth, is what allows independent nation states to, exist side by side, to have disagreements about things, but not be in a state of security dilemmas and, these other kinds of profound problems that used to be really sort of endemic to Europe.
Right, and we should assure our listeners that and viewers that we're not straw manning here, right? I mean, if you go back to the way people, and I'm a little bit older than you, so I remember it a little bit more clearly. People were genuinely talking about this, and they weren't talking about it just in sort of the American realist community. They were talking about it in Europe. They were talking about the potential for a return to the politics of the pre-EU of the first half of the 20th century once the Soviet threat went away. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, right. And the other thing, which is extremely important, is that access into the European Union market for goods and services has been this very powerful magnet to the countries of Eastern Europe, that, Poland, Czech Republic, now into the Baltics. Countries want in on that. Their companies want to be able to export to these markets. They want to be able to have people moving across the borders, things like that. There's very concrete benefits in those terms, and that's been a very sort of powerful, I think, force in Eastern Europe, both in improving the economies, but also in improving the politics, and a potentially very fraught situation where you have these newly independent or de facto independent for the first time countries, and they've all sort of understood themselves to be in this process of getting into Europe and of economically and politically integrating with a very successful group of countries. So, unfortunately, I think the single currency was a bridge too far. But the question Germans have to ask themselves, and French people too, is it actually possible to uncross that bridge without undoing much more of the institutional framework? Because if you have to go forwards or backwards, if you're forced to choose, I think going further forwards is clearly the better option.
Right.
I've heard that unfortunately mostly from retired politicians who are able to speak in very sort of grand terms about what this all means. In practice, it turns out people prefer not to have their tax money sent to foreigners.
Right. I mean, and the forward versus backward has been a question that, I mean, again, it's not simply of academic interest, right? It sort of was built into the logic of the EEC with this functionalist understanding that that there were going to be enough benefits built in that when push came to shove, when there was a crisis, people were always going to choose forward rather than backward. And I think we're seeing a severe test of that now. So what are the effects of Hollande going to be on sort of the policy of the ECB, or sort of more generally the German approach? I mean, I guess we've seen a lot about what the tensions will be and so forth. But I mean, what are the things that are most likely to happen now that we do in fact have a new president in France?
Well, so I was told yesterday by people who I think are in a position to know that there's a sort of likely fallback that Merkel can retreat to that would be, that would sort of give Hollande a victory. And that would be to say, so Germany got everyone to agree to these structural budget deficit targets. And those are defined in terms of a percent of GDP. And so now economic growth has come in worse than people were expecting when they agreed to those targets. So the technical terms of the agreement say, well, growth has been worse than we expected, so we need to cut our budgets even more than we agreed to previously. And so what I was told is that one very likely concession for Merkel to make is to say, no, all you have to do is the cuts that were previously agreed to, right? That the relative to GDP part isn't relevant. That the path we're already on is okay, and we don't need to do the extra austerity that's sort of built into the legalisms of the agreement. That would be a sensible change. It's also something that Merkel can defend as not backsliding, on the commitments that have already been made, but that Hollande can easily present as a real and meaningful victory that has a sort of substantial change. And the Italian government has sort of come out in favor of that proposal, and there's some, whisperings that this is sort of the deal that's going to be made. So that's not a transformational move, but it's a move. But something that's important is that it's a move that's conditional on the German government feeling as if the other governments it's working with are trustworthy. And they definitely have that in the case of Italy and Spain right now, and presumably will have it in the case of France, but they really don't have it in the case of Greece. And Greece is a small country which is not super significant on its own terms, but the fact that it's considered to be unreliable as well as very, very troubled, it throws a wrench into the works. There's an amount of leeway that they are willing to give to the new Italian government that they have not been willing to give to Greeks, and now the Greeks don't have a government at all to even give leeway to.
Right. I mean, they have almost no way to fulfill any commitments that they even might be convinced to make, which very few political actors in Greece have an incentive to make right now because these commitments are extraordinarily unpopular with the Greek population.
Right, and I mean, if we can shift into that a little bit, they just had this election that produced enormous setbacks for the two sort of main political parties, huge gains for far right and far left parties. I don't think you want to get too alarmist as to what it means, but it is that sort of, end of the Weimar Republic kind of thing where the scope for what could constitute a working parliamentary majority has gotten, very, very sort of troubled. Basically political parties who reject the whole sort of conceptual framework have tons and tons of seats now, and they actually underperformed their vote total because of some quirk in the Greek electoral system. Right. So basically, none of the Greek politicians, who are kicking around, want to make the kind of commitments the Germans want from them. Nobody believes anybody because the Greeks have been cooking the books before. The two main Greek parties hate each other and don't want to cooperate. So, it's not clear where the coalition talks are going to go, if there's going to have to be more elections, or if we're heading toward, some kind of just total meltdown of the process there.
Right.
And that just makes it creates a strange context for readjusting the fundamental Franco-German bargains, because I think people don't want to make sort of preemptive concessions toward the Greek situation, and so would like to settle that first, but it's not clear that it will be settled in any kind of reasonable time. So now what they seem to be putting out to the newspapers is this theory that that if Greece were to somehow leave the euro, that the rest of it could all still stick together.
Which seems very problematic, right? I mean, given the new incentive structure that will be presented when Greece leaves, when essentially the option of leaving becomes available to not just Greece but some other countries, that would be it would seem to be extremely difficult for Europe to navigate that particular structure without sort of going all the way back and then rebuilding from scratch around some sort of much smaller or much differently oriented monetary union.
Yeah, I mean it's difficult to know if the Germans actually think this and are confused or know something we don't know or are just bluffing. But it seems like, if you go here in the United States, right, people in West Virginia keep their money in West Virginia banks because they believe that it is genuinely inconceivable that West Virginia would somehow not be part of the U.S. dollar. Right, that there's nothing to hedge against there. If people thought there was even like a small chance, like a 5% chance, like maybe West Virginia is going to become an independent and super poor country, everyone would take their money out of those West Virginia banks and they would put them, in regular Virginia banks where it's going to be safe, and then the economy of West Virginia, which, though it's a relatively poor state, it's not like a basket case, it would immediately collapse because there'll be no liquidity. So if Greece can go, you can't really say to a Portuguese or Irish or Spanish saver, oh, look, it's inconceivable that the euro is going to break up, because it's obviously not inconceivable. Greece just left. And I don't really know what you do then. Once the breakup is something that every business is hedging against, it starts to become like it's looking almost inevitable. And also Greece is small. It's cheaper to bail Greece out than to bail Spain out.
Right.
So logic says you do it in Greece. Ill will about Greek sort of lying about its earlier budget numbers, and generally, it's kind of Greeks have a bad image. So that may be pushing some, I think, sort of irrational responses.
Right. No, that's true. Can we pause on that point? Because I'm actually I'm kind of interested. Regarding how the Greek situation is perceived, not just in Europe but also in the United States.
Yeah.
I have noticed following progressives and sort of left progressives more specifically, I don't know if the word alarming is quite correct, but a surprising degree of sympathy by American left progressives for the Greek situation. In ways that I don't, I mean, sort of and I guess this stems from a general association of sort of responsibility for Greece's bad situation, also associating with sort of the broader reasons for the economic collapse, which can be associated with leveraging in banks and so forth, which seems wrong-headed for two notions. The first notion being that, there's a lot of reasons that Greece is in trouble, and many of those reasons are attributable to Greeks. And the second being that progressives really ought to be sad about anything that threatens the collapse of the European Union. Right? I mean, which is not to say that progressives have to be happy, especially progressive policy wonks have to be happy with every aspect of how the European Union operates, right? And there are good reasons to disagree with many aspects. But that, sort of more broadly speaking, the European Union as we alluded to before, this really profoundly successful progressive internationalist project, liberal internationalist project. And liberal internationalist in a good way, right? Not even like IMF liberal internationalist, but I mean really how progressives would like to imagine the international system working.
Absolutely.
Right? And so it's a little bit odd, and from my point of view, a little bit disappointing that there seems among some American progressives to be this lack of regard for that project. And I mean, I can understand why American conservatives, are skeptical about the EU and, don't like the Greeks and, are cheering for the Germans and basically want the EU to collapse. But I wish there would be more understanding among American progressives that the EU is sort of really genuinely a good thing. But it seems to have been caught up in the whole rest of the economic crisis. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain, tendency to just sort of map U.S. partisan disputes onto these European conflicts in a way that, I think is a little confused and doesn't do a great deal of justice to the situation. I mean, the fact is there's a number of other countries that, like Greece, would not have been appropriate candidates for Euro membership. But in theory, could have somehow gotten stuck in for some historical contingent reason and would have blown the whole thing up. But they didn't, because the history is different. But so, you don't see people, crying into their soup about the state of Serbia, for example, which is much poorer than Greece, and is, in fact, in part poorer than Greece for some of these same reasons. Except, correctly, a country like that wasn't put into the monetary union. Whereas Greece, by wheedling its way into this thing, has really destabilized a whole project which is much bigger than Greece and has done an enormous amount of good in a huge number of ways. Americans, associate concern with budget deficits with Pete Peterson and this kind of project to cut Social Security benefits, and so are very, I think, hostile to kind of deficit scold type talk. At the same time, it's really true that you cannot govern a country the way Greece was being governed, where you don't collect taxes, you submit erroneous budget data to people, you partner up with Goldman Sachs to do kind of elaborate currency swaps to hide the amount of borrowing you're doing. That just doesn't. It doesn't work.
You spend twice the percentage of GDP as any other European country on defense too, right? And that's another one of these underspoken things that sort of you wish people would notice more of it. I mean that they really have poured money into defense and what is an absurd effort to keep up with Turkey. And that has contributed significantly to Greece's economic straits.
Well, right, and part of what you have going on is, perfectly nice, friendly, social democracies in the Netherlands and Denmark who've done nothing wrong are now finding themselves in trouble because of this monetary association with a, kind of fly-by-night, much more poorly governed Southern European country that, yeah, is pursuing this military vendetta with Turkey for no reason, and that, well, I think any ordinary American progressive should reflect the idea that you have to build a functioning tax enforcement system, and you do have to pay for your social welfare benefits. And Greece is simply not that rich a country, and cannot afford to provide a certain full scope of benefits. I mean, one of the things I would always say in a domestic context for the United States is that it's crazy for the richest country on earth to have people going without basic medical care. And that's a very fundamental part of American political economy. Greece is not the richest country on earth, which is unfortunate for them, and means that they certainly can't, they can't afford certain things, and it's too bad. And I wish they would do better. But it's, I don't know what are you supposed to do about it.
Right. So, are you still there? You broke up for a second.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So, let's take this. I mean, now that we've started at least talking a little bit about the United States, let's start big and then get a little bit smaller. I mean, what are sort of the global macroeconomic consequences of the current situation in Europe going to be? I mean, we're already seeing Europe slip back into recession, largely because of monetary and fiscal issues. I mean, my first guess is that many countries that are dependent on the health of the European economy for consumer or whatever reasons are also going to start suffering problems. And I mean, I haven't really worked out exactly where those countries are going to be, but they're obviously going to be countries that are dependent on Europe as a market for their goods. And I don't know the extent to which China exports to the European Union, but certainly Russia does. And Russia doesn't really produce much in the way of manufactured goods. But anyway, I mean, what are going to be the macroeconomic consequences of what is almost certain to be, whether we have a collapse of the euro or not, a pretty significant slowdown in the European economy?
Yeah, I mean, it's not good news for the Chinese economy. They sell a fair amount of consumer goods there, much like they do here in the United States. For their energy suppliers, it's also quite bad. The more unemployment goes up, it's just less commuting, standard kind of thing there. For the U.S., it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I mean, we don't have a ton of direct exports to Europe, and a lot of what we do export is agricultural commodities, and presumably people are going to keep eating. I mean, it's not going to get that bad. And then on the flip side, we benefit from reduced gasoline and oil demand over there. But a lot of our stock market may go down a lot. That's happened sort of the last time this went into an acute phase. People just sort of started selling stocks willy-nilly. And that was bad for our economic situation overall. Also, insofar as it's not so much that we do have a ton of export exposure to Europe, but we've been hoping to get out of our own recession, in part through having a cheaper dollar and more exports globally. This is going to cause a lot of flight into the U.S. dollar, and it's going to be bad for the whole worldwide sort of picture of exports of American-made goods. And it
we're looking at a consumption crisis in Europe, not a production crisis. This isn't like World War II when Europe stopped producing stuff and the U.S. benefited, right? I mean, Europe is going to continue producing stuff just because, well, their currency situation is going to be even more attractive to buy their particular stuff.
Yeah, I mean exactly. And things, manufactured goods from there are going to wind up cheaper, which is going to be sort of a big, a problem for our stuff over there. We're going to lose tourists, things like that, possibly lose software markets. And like everything, it just sort of further complicates this situation that we have with the Chinese, who I think don't always have the most nuanced understanding of this whole kind of dynamic. Some of them seem to think that America wants Europe to fail because it will sort of increase our relative standing, which I don't think is how anyone in the United States actually sees it. And in the worst case scenario, the European financial intermediation breaks down because there's a fair amount of integration of the banking systems from the U.S. to Europe, and so people are borrowing and lending money through European banks. And in some sense, if the banking system collapses, that's very bad news, although unlikely.
Right, unlikely. But that could be the sort of massive shock that you almost saw. You basically saw in October of 2008,
right?
Which obviously caused fairly profound effects for the 2008 election, even if it didn't quite determine which direction it went.
Right.
Regarding our calendar, though. It seems to me that people have been sort of more generally have been a little bit more cagey. That sort of the last set of agreements that seem to paper all of this over. I seem to get the sense from reading a lot of people that it was going to be sufficient to paper over any general collapse until the U.S. election had run its course. And I guess my sense now is that may not be true, right? I mean, even to the extent that, I guess another way to phrase it is that if the Europeans can kick the football down the field, just one or two more times, which is entirely possible, then we're looking at past November 2012. But there's also now a strong possibility that that's simply not going to happen, right? That the time of reckoning is going to come at some time before 2012, and even in the lack of what we might call real economic effects, that there are going to be important monetary effects which are going to play out very badly for the U.S. economy, and that consequently would sort of almost definitely affect how the U.S. election played out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of very limitless capacity, I think, for the Europeans to sort of kick this down the road. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that each time they sort of have to kick it again, you have this moment of panic where it's like, well, oh my God, maybe they won't work it out. And so far they've kept doing it, and there's no reason to think they can't keep doing it. Mm-hmm. But the more times, you run up against the tipping point, the more opportunities you have, to screw up just through some failure of coordination. And, a disorderly sort of blow up there, at a minimum in the short term, it's going to, be a huge blow to sort of confidence that people have in the United States. People will in the very short term, pull back, and it could have a sort of a huge domestic political impact here. In a negative way. I mean, I know the Obama administration is frustrated because there's not a ton they can actually do to influence this. But it seems very, it seems very important. It's very substantively important. It's probably very politically important to them. It's something they would love to, pull a bunch of all-nighters on and solve the problem, but they can't. I mean, it's not it's not up to them, and it's not within their disposal. And presidents, are always buffeted by external events, but I do think that Americans, after a couple decades of sort of congratulating ourselves on polarity and so on and so forth, are waking up to a world where, as has always been the case for smaller countries, this kind of stuff just sometimes happens where, foreign dynamics can have a big impact on our lives, and we can't really do anything about it, that the world is just a big place, and there's lots of stuff going on.
Right, I mean, this kind of brings me back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, which is how, previously, European leaders had observed this norm of generally not directly interfering in their neighbors' elections. But Merkel is sort of quasi-violating this norm, and I think Cameron sort of did the same thing. But I mean, are you actually just sort of getting a as the internal economic and political dynamics of country X increasingly have more of an effect, but just because of the way that this was in the modern global economy functions, increasingly have more of an effect on country A, B, C, all through Y and Z. Do you increasingly see people like Cameron, or sort of in another sector, people like Bibi Netanyahu, just making more and more direct and explicit statements about their preferences regarding the political orderings of other democracies? In other words, is the Merkel sort of quasi, or even sort of almost explicitly, backing Sarkozy? Is this the future we're looking at, where democracies really do seem to start caring a lot and even start playing major politics in their fellow democracies?
Yeah, I mean, it could be. It seems like there's a limited scope to do that effectively, right? I mean, I think it was no secret that most European political leaders preferred Barack Obama in 2008 to John McCain because John McCain was crazy. But I mean, I don't think anyone in America thinks it would have been helpful to Obama's campaign to have like some French politicians fly over here and be like, "Hey, Barack Obama," and that was what Merkel found out is that even however many 70 years later it is, basically nobody in Europe wants German politicians flying to town and trying to sort of pick their leaders for them. Netanyahu is in an unusual situation where I think the conventional wisdom in the United States is that being well thought of by Israeli politicians is actually helpful to American politicians, which I think it's fairly rare that you can say that that's true, right? I mean, if Stephen Harper was to make joint appearances with Mitt Romney. How does that help Romney? So,
right.
I mean, you'll see it. I think if voters start responding positively to that kind of thing.
I mean, there was a lot of pushback from the right on Cameron. I mean, and it was pushback not of the sort of like, oh my goodness, I mean, look at these evil people that are
right.
endorsing Obama, as you would see in the French case. It was traitor, treason, and so forth. Those sorts of arguments about Cameron's what seemed to many of them to be a quasi-Cameron recommendation of Obama, which may simply suggest that there are, and maybe not just the Israeli, but also potentially the British, there are some set of countries that still potentially carry a little bit of weight in terms of regard for American leaders.
Right. Well, and of course, I mean, there's a difference within. Well, for one thing, I mean, within the European community, there's a formal, intergovernmental political process. So it almost seems like, well, the leaders should actually be campaigning with one another, right? That it's illogical to not be weighing in on Dutch politics.
Right.
And then within the English-speaking countries, there's the fact that on a cultural level, on a sort of a level of discourse, there is an enormous unity. I mean, that we have English-born and Canadian-born political pundits, writing in our newspapers here, and our television shows just broadcast directly, and vice versa, so that
right.
you can actually have a meaningful political dialogue between the U.S., U.K., Canada, things like that, in a way that's not possible in Europe. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, the Anglophone world is special, I think, in that regard. Also because in the Anglophone countries, conservative politicians seem to be appreciative of American nationalism in a way that you don't necessarily see in other countries. That, Jacques Chirac and George W. Bush did not get along, but Bush got along great with what's his name, Howard, in Australia.
Right.
There's almost there's something of a common nationalism.
Right. Well, and that regard for American nationalism was very important to Bush's relationship with Blair as well. So it wasn't
right.
It wasn't just among the conservative parties, but also, I mean, basically anybody who is in this sort of Anglosphere, who does express that degree of, and I guess this would also apply to the Israelis, right? Who does express that degree of of appreciation for American nationalism is sort of considered in the family.
Yeah, no, exactly. So there's that sort of bond, whereas then, in Europe, there's this long tradition of nominal international cooperation by the social democratic parties, but it's never really worked, right? I mean, that's sort of the famous thing about the various iterations of the Socialist International, is that, the workers, such as they are, ultimately, when World War I happened, when all these things happened, people stick with their countries.
Right.
And, to what extent has that really changed? It seems like it hasn't changed a great deal, and that, national loyalties are still paramount over there, and that in the U.S. context, you have this sort of quirky difference.
Right. You've read, or have you read, Desmond Denon's work, Ever Closer Union, his book?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Familiar with that book? First 3 or 4 editions of that book, which I used to assign my European Union book, or in my European Union class, which I don't teach anymore, but Ever Closer Union ?
Right.
And then in his introduction to the 5th or 6th, I'm probably getting the numbers wrong, very explicit that there's no question mark anymore, right? That we're deleting the question mark. It's simply Ever Closer Union. Does the next one deserve another question mark? I mean, if there is another edition, should it have another question mark?
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems like, I think a lot of analysts outside the United States thought that the euro was going to run into this exact problem that it's run into. And I think that the people who were savvy about European Union politics thought that the Europeans also realized that, and that this was sort of the plan unfolding, is that you would do the monetary union, you would have the growth crisis, and that would spur the next level of European integration. And that, this really was Ever Closer Union in action. Then when the moment of crisis hit, it seemed like a lot of people were suddenly confused. Like they had no idea this could occur. There was no, off-the-shelf plan for a common bank regulator. And so it's left me, at least, a little bit uncertain. I mean, my understanding of how this worked was that you were going to have the moment of crisis, and then the Germans and the French were going to roll out their common fiscal paradigm, and and it would be ugly. There'd be a big fight. You'd have one of these things where everyone has to have their referendums, and you sometimes have to make the Irish vote 7 times for them to go along with it. But the fact that hasn't happened, has, I think, called it all into question, and maybe some countries just signed on for commitments that they didn't fully understand, or signed on for things for the wrong kinds of reasons. That the Finns, have some political reasons for wanting to be in the euro as a sort of, I guess, an ersatz NATO membership. But it's not clear that was rigorously considered as an economic proposition, that the political system seems to have reacted very poorly to the idea that Finland is now tied in with Greece. So yeah, I mean, I think, it's a real open question as to whether the whole thing starts running backwards now.
All right. Well, I think it's been a great conversation. Do you have anything else to say before we go?
No, that's it. That's it. Once you get to Finland, it's time to stop talking.
Listen, we could go on about Finnish security policy and Finnish NATO policy and so forth, because there's a ton of interesting stuff. But
there you go.
Probably only the 1/3 of a single human being who's from Finland who watches Foreign Entanglements would have any appreciation for it. So.
Absolutely. All right.
All right. Well, thanks, Matt, and thank you very much, Foreign Entanglements viewers, and we will return next week.
Yeah, absolutely.